Welcome to the Philosophy of Today. I'm Jim Hammond. In 1838, Edgar Allan Poe published a novel called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. In that novel, the ship capsizes and 4 men are cast adrift in a small boat. They run out of food and water. One of them, Richard Parker, suggests that they draw lots and sacrifice the loser as food for the other 3. So they draw lots, Richard Parker loses, and he's killed and eaten. Now let's turn from fiction to fact, from literature to history. In 1884, a ship called the Mignonette set sail from England heading for Australia. It had a 4-man crew. One of the crew members was named Richard Parker. The Mignonette capsized and the crew took to a lifeboat. The men were short of food and water. Richard Parker sank into what may have been a coma, and he was killed and eaten by the other crew members. So Poe's fictional work, Arthur Gordon Pym, has a striking resemblance to a historical event. But the event didn't take place until 46 years after the publication of the novel. Maybe this is just a coincidence, but what are the odds that both Richard Parkers would be on ships that sank? Both would be cast adrift in lifeboats that had 4 people. Both lifeboats would be reduced to the extremity of cannibalism, and both Richard Parkers would be chosen as victims. Aren't those odds very slim? Aren't they like the odds of flipping a coin 100 times and getting heads every time? And if you get 100 heads in a row, don't you look around for some other explanation? Something besides chance. When something strange happens, when an anomaly appears, shouldn't the philosopher and the scientist get to work? Shouldn't they search for an explanation? An anomaly is like a thread that you can follow, a thread that sometimes leads to a major discovery. So where else could we look for an explanation? If the Richard Parker matter isn't just a coincidence, what could it be? I suggest that we look to the basic principles of the philosophy of today. Everything is connected, everything is alive. Space and time aren't absolute. Space and time are constructs of the human mind, as Kant said. Space and time are relativized in the unconscious, as Jung put it. It's possible to leap over space and time. It's possible to sense, when you're in New York, what's happening in Los Angeles. And it's possible to sense on Monday what's going to happen on Tuesday. If these principles are true, then perhaps we have another way to view the Richard Parker matter, another way besides saying it's just a coincidence. Perhaps Poe could sense in 1838 something that took place in 1884. Perhaps his unconscious, his intuition, sensed the future, though Poe himself wasn't aware that he was sensing the future, wasn't aware that his fiction would someday become fact. If our basic principles can explain the Richard Parker matter, if they provide the best explanation of this anomaly, then we'd be inclined to think that these principles are true. We'd be inclined to say, maybe we were right when we said that everything is connected and everything is alive. Maybe we were right when we said that it's possible to leap over space and time. So while our principles can help us to explain the Richard Parker matter, perhaps the Richard Parker matter can help us to verify our principles. If the Richard Parker matter isn't just a coincidence, then it suggests that the future can be anticipated far in advance. The future already exists in some sense. It suggests that some kind of fate is at work in human affairs. It suggests that all the particular causes of an event aren't really causing the event because the event is fated to occur. In short, if the Richard Parker matter isn't just a coincidence, we need to rethink our whole view of the world, our view of history, our view of causality, etc. Let's look at a situation that's similar to the Richard Parker situation. In 1912, the Titanic sank. It sank in the North Atlantic in April. It was considered the largest ship of its time. It was traveling at an excessive speed. It struck an iceberg. It didn't have enough lifeboats. 14 years earlier, in 1898, an American novelist, Morgan Robertson, published a novel called Futility, which deals with a ship called Titan. Titan sank in the North Atlantic in April. It was considered the largest ship of its time. It was traveling at an excessive speed. It struck an iceberg. It didn't have enough lifeboats. Again, we have a fictional work that anticipates an historical event. Again, we have a string of coincidences, rather like flipping a coin and getting heads 100 times in a row. Again, we start to wonder, could it be something other than a coincidence? Again, we suspect that the author had a hunch, an intuition about the future. We suspect that time isn't absolute, that time isn't linear, past, present, future. We suspect that in some sense the future exists already. Past, present, and future are jumbled up together. They coexist. Our common sense view of the world, which includes linear time and linear space, isn't the whole story. It's said that philosophy begins with wonder, astonishment, amazement. What could be more astonishing than a fictional work that describes something that takes place many years later? The occult is the philosophical subject par excellence because occult phenomena are so astonishing, so mysterious. In the future, philosophers will deal with the occult far more than they have in the past. So the philosophy of today is inclined to believe in fate, inclined to believe that future events are fated to occur. And the philosophy of today is inclined to believe in the possibility of prophecy, i.e., the possibility of foreseeing the future. One might say that fate and prophecy are two departments of the occult, just as telepathy and life after death are two departments of the occult. The occult is a vast field with many subdivisions. One of the oldest questions in philosophy is, what governs the world, fate or free will? Since the philosophy of today believes in fate, does that mean that it doesn't believe in freedom? I would say that the philosophy of today believes in both fate and freedom. One might say that the philosophy of today isn't an either-or worldview, it's a both-and worldview. We don't believe that fate and freedom is an either-or matter. We feel ourselves to be free here and now, but we also believe in fate. Someone might ask, isn't that a contradiction? Yes, but we believe that truth is contradictory, reality is contradictory. Physicists say that light is a particle, but light is also a wave. Physicists have been forced to accept contradiction, have been forced to admit that this is a both-and universe. We believe that philosophers should accept contradiction too. The physicist Niels Bohr said there are two kinds of truths. There are the superficial truths, the opposite of which are obviously wrong, but there are also the profound truths whose opposites are equally right. In an earlier video, we discussed the writer Leo Strauss, who argued that a great thinker wouldn't contradict himself accidentally. Strauss said that if a great thinker contradicts himself, he must be doing so intentionally. He must be concealing his real views behind the veil of contradiction. He must be dodging the censors. Strauss was a rational thinker who couldn't accept that contradiction is embedded in reality, embedded in human thought. Since academia is fond of rational thinking, Strauss enjoys a certain popularity in academia. Jung wasn't a rational thinker. He respected the unconscious more than reason. Hence, Jung accepted contradiction. He even praised one of his disciples, Agnella Jaffe, for being contradictory. Jaffe later wrote, Jung was highly inconsistent and well aware of this fact. Many formulations in his writings seem inconsistent too. But as the nature of the psyche is not straightforward and does not always obey the laws of logic, these inconsistencies are only apparently out of place. They reflect psychic truth better than straightforward thinking. So it was high praise, though of an unusual kind, when Jung informed me one day that I had been gloriously inconsistent. Contradiction is not only in the world of theory, it's also in the everyday world. Ask someone if they like their job, and you'll probably hear, "I like it, but also dislike it." Ask someone what they think about life in general, and you may hear the same thing. You may get a response that's conflicted, contradictory. At the end of his long life, Jung was asked to sum it up. He was asked to deliver a verdict on life. He responded, "I'm astonished, disappointed, pleased with myself. I am distressed, depressed, rapturous. I am all these things at once and cannot add up the sum." In other words, Jung's verdict on life was contradictory, similar to the person who says they like their job but also dislike it. So contradiction is embedded in reality, embedded in human thought, and almost all deep thinkers accept it. The philosophy of today accepts contradiction. More specifically, it accepts the contradiction between fate and freedom, and it insists that human events are governed by both fate and freedom. As I mentioned before, Poe published Arthur Gordon Pym in 1838. At about the same time, Alexis de Tocqueville published Democracy in America, in which he predicted that the US and Russia would one day be the strongest nations. Let's call this a prediction rather than a prophecy. Tocqueville's prediction is based on conscious thinking. He's aware of what he's doing. Let's reserve the word prophecy for a hunch, an intuition, an act of the unconscious. Let's distinguish prophecy from prediction. Likewise, when we say everything is connected, we don't mean visible connections, conscious connections. We don't mean the kind of connections that ecology makes. We don't mean, for example, the way that fertilizer affects Narragansett Bay, and conditions in the bay affect fish, and the fish affect the seabirds who eat the fish. I'm not denying that these connections exist. I'm saying that these aren't the only kind of connections. There's also a mysterious connectedness, an invisible connectedness, the kind of connectedness that we saw in telepathy, the kind of connectedness that we saw in quantum physics, in the paired particles experiment and the double slit experiment. So we should distinguish between prediction and prophecy. Prophecy is an occult phenomenon, an act of the unconscious. Prediction is based on depth of thought. Likewise, we should distinguish between the connectedness of ecology, which is based on rational thinking, and the connectedness of telepathy and quantum physics, which is baffling to rational thinking, which is mysterious and invisible. In the last video, I said that the philosophy of today would re-examine Darwin's theory, that the philosophy of today doesn't believe that Darwin has fully explained evolution, that Darwin emphasized chance in the environment and left no room for the individual creature's will or spirit or drive or instinct, that the individual is passive in Darwin's theory. A couple days ago, I came across a quote from the English writer Coleridge, who said the same thing about Newton that I said about Darwin. Coleridge said, "Mind in Newton's system is always passive, a lazy looker-on and on an external world. If the mind be not passive, there is ground for suspicion that any system built on the passiveness of the mind must be false as a system." This is the same argument I would make about Darwin. His theory must be false because while it emphasizes chance in the environment, it makes the individual passive. For the Hermetic thinkers of the Romantic period, like Goethe, Coleridge, and Blake, Newton was the bad guy, the bête noire, because he broke the interconnected world into separate pieces. He turned the organism into a mechanism. Perhaps the Hermetic thinkers of our time will be as skeptical of Darwin as the Romantics were of Newton. I'm not suggesting that chance and mutation aren't involved in evolution, and I'm not suggesting that the selection of the fittest isn't involved. I'm simply saying that there's more to it, that Darwin hasn't told the whole story, that there's some sort of will or urge or instinct or synchronicity that's involved in evolution. If Newton and Darwin make the individual passive, I've done just the opposite in these videos. I've described the individual as active, creative, forceful. I've spoken of all sorts of powers inside the individual. The life and death instincts, will, spirit, mind over matter, the ability of the mind to mold circumstances, the spark of life, the quintessence, occult powers like telepathy and synchronicity, perhaps even life after death and reincarnation. So while Newton and Darwin depict the individual as a passive observer, the product of chance in the environment, I depict the individual as possessing almost unlimited powers. As Jung put it, nobody can say where man ends. The unconscious of man can reach God knows where. While I've talked about the powers within man, I haven't focused entirely on man. After all, most of these powers are also possessed by animals, even plants, even non-living particles. By looking at man, we can deepen our understanding of the universe in general, and conversely, by looking at particles, we can deepen our understanding of man. Unus mundus, one world. By the way, if you want to give any feedback on the show, we have an email address, which is today@ljhammond.com, and there's a website, ljhammond.com/today. If you go to that website, you'll get more information about the people that we're discussing. So that's all for today, and thank you for watching.